In this final segment, we will look at the labor force. And for this, we would study immigration and demography, the lesson from Japan, and the lesson from Vietnam. I think this is a very fascinating chart because there are more people living inside this circle than outside of it. Well, if you look closely, we have China, India, and Indonesia. Indonesia is the world's fourth largest population, right? So 3 out of the 4 countries with the largest population is inside this circle, right? Okay. And again, potential GDP is about labor force. It's not about population, right? So to the extent that the labor force in China is aging, right? This is offset by the very young population in Indonesia. Okay. Right. So when we look at the case of the U.S., we see that the U.S. working population growth has been declining. And to about 0 now, right? So basically not growing, right? This is because we have the baby boomers, they are retiring, and we have yet to see the children of the baby boomers, the millennials, coming into the labor force in a number that is greater and able to more than offset the decline in the baby boomers leaving like, the workforce. Right? This chart illustrates very well the importance of net immigration to the U.S. Right? So in terms of the natural growth, right, we see that we have very high new entrants in the labor force in the 1990s. And then now we are seeing the aging population. Right? Fortunately for the US, for a long time, we have net immigration here, right? Which help to offset the decline in the workforce, right? Which gives us a somewhat steady state here, right? So if the policy were to change dramatically, where the US no longer allowed immigration coming in, talented or not talented, then what we have would be there's no offset, and the net line would then drop. Okay, right? So the net shrinkage in labor force would offset whatever productivity number that we have. Right? So at that point, instead of potential GDP growing at 1.92%, we could be growing at say 1.5, right? Which is very interesting for monetary policy because uh, if we are growing at 1.7%, and it depends on what is potential GDP. If potential GDP is still 2%, then 1.7% actual growth will be considered less than potential GDP. Therefore, the Fed would have to cut rates. But if potential GDP falls from 2% to 1.5, then the 1.7% actual growth would be considered too fast, right? Would be higher than potential GDP of 1.5%. The Fed would have to raise rates, right? So we see how the immigration policy is connected to the labor force, is connected to productivity, and in turn to potential GDP and monetary policy, right? Now moving on to Japan, right? We are familiar with the aging population in Japan, and this is the population age 15 to 64, right? We see that there's a shrinkage in their labor force, right? The surprising thing is that the Japanese was able to continue to increase the total employment, right? Despite a falling labor force. How do they do it? Well, they they bring back a lot of their retirees, right? So this was the major factor, right, how they are able to create jobs, right? They bring the retirees back into the market. So 65 years and above. Then they also bring back the women. Right? Traditionally, in Japan, women is not a big part of labor force. So they have changed the policy and they strongly encourage women to be in the labor force. Then the third one is foreign workers, right? So we know that there's a limit to how many women they can bring to labor force, and we also know there's a limit to how long the people who are above 65 years old can work, or should they work, and would they be willing to work, right? Because many people by the time they're 80 years old, they could barely walk, forget about working, right? They could hardly walk. So, how to get them to work, right? So the ultimate answer would be either the Japanese, right, encourage more couples to have babies, and that takes time for the babies to become part of the labor force, or they allow foreign workers, right? Allow more foreign workers to come into the country, right? Obviously, this would be a political decision, and it's a matter of how do you convince the citizen that some of these jobs are given to foreign workers, even though these are jobs that the Japanese themselves don't want it, right? We are going to see a similar situation in China, right? Because the boom, right, in the workforce in China is over. Right? It's over, and now in 2020 we are beginning to see this downward projection in the labor force, right? So a potential GDP in China is between 6.5 to 7%. And to the extent that we're going to see a shrinkage in the labor force, right? Okay, then the potential GDP in China will start to move down, right? From 6.5 to 7 to maybe 5 to 5.5, 5.5 to 6, right? Over time. Right? Okay. And when you look at a map like this, right, here, this is from the Economist magazine, citing the United Nations data. Working age people needed to immigrate or emigrate by 2030 to keep the dependency ratio at 2016 level, right? So you see this orangey color here. This is 20 to 30%, 20 to 30%, right? And in contrast, you have Laos, right, which is have excess worker of 20 to 30%. So Laos would be exporting workers out, right? And China would need to import workers. And it's very difficult to try to imagine a China where in an office of 100 workers, 20 to 30 would be non-Chinese, right? In an office of 100 workers, 20 to 30 would be non-Chinese, right? You go out on the street, right, you see of 100 people, 20 or 30 are non-Chinese, right? Well, if we don't see the scenario, then the China's dependency ratio would get worse. That means that they would have less and less working people to support the same number and the number of retirees that is growing over time. Okay. Then somebody will say, but China has come up with the policy to allow a second child. Yes, but if you look at the data, you see that the increase in second child has offset the decline in first children, right? So here you see this is the first child, right? So couples having the first child, right, has declined, right? Okay, and fortunately, it's offset by the increase in the second child, right? The net effect is that there's not much change in the number of birth. The number of birth, right? Okay, is about unchanged, right? So this begs the question then is, what is common among the members of this group? Why are they not having the first child? Is it because they're poor or they're the middle class? If money is a problem, then this can be solved because countries can then give uh, a baby bonus, right? Every couple that have the first child would get a certain cash gift from the government to help them to defray the monetary burden of bringing up a child, right? However, if it is because it's a new generation of people who don't want to have kids, who don't want to get married, then it's a much harder problem to solve. Right? And this is where a lot of work needs to be done. A very powerful tableau function would be to use cluster analysis to try to figure out what is actually happening, right, in this environment. Well, the third point is to learn from Vietnam. Right? Learn from Vietnam, and as you can see in this picture here, there's a lot of young people. It's a lot of motorcycles, right? Okay. And when you look at the median age, right, in Vietnam, the median age is 30 years old, right? So history is going to write about how Vietnam is an extremely lucky country in the sense that they have the right government who open up the economy at the right time to foreign direct investment, right? At the right time when they open up the door, like foreign investors come in, build factories, and there are plenty of young people looking for a job, right? If this policy would be implemented at the wrong time, right, when there's not enough young people, companies come in, open up factories, not enough workers, wages goes up, they close shop, they go elsewhere, right? And when there are a lot of young people and no foreign investment comes in, there's no job, then there's problem, right? For me, I'm very interested to look at Pakistan and the Philippines because their median age is now 23 and 24. Right? The perfect age for their government to think about opening up the country for foreign direct investment. And if so, then they can get themselves into a very nice positive cycle. Okay, right. When you look at the Philippines, right, and to some extent Indonesia, you see that from a cost perspective, they are very, very competitive, right? To countries, to companies that have their location in United States, Germany, right, and even China, right, would consider, right, moving the factories into the Philippines or Indonesia. Right? And this chart shows you the share of population age babies to 14 years old and 65 and above, right? And here I want to show you the blue bars here. This is the percentage age 0 to 14, right? You will see that in these countries, they have a lot more young people than the retirees, right? So this makes it makes the dependency ratio very positive for this country, right? Because as these young people grow up, they become workers, they pay taxes, right? And there's so many of them that they can easily support the small amount of retirees, right? And also in the case of Vietnam, right? Just now when we look at the median age, right, they are about 30 years old. They were the first generation that benefited from FDI coming in, right? And as this first generation get promoted to become middle managers, we have this group, these young people who will then be growing up, right, to be the entry level people to take over from the first generation. So there's tremendous amount of resources that can prolong and promote this positive cycle. But then the question then is what happened in India, right? Okay, and the Philippines, right? They too have a lot of young people, right? Okay, are they able to create enough jobs for these young people? Okay? That is going to be in the labor force in the next 10 years. Right? What is surprising to me is that in India, uh, this is young people not in employment, education, or training, right? And in India, about almost 30% of the young people in the age group 15 to 24, right? 3 out of 10 of these young people are not in employment, they're not in education, and they're not in training. So, we wonder what are they doing, right? If they have no job, they're not in schools, they're not in training, then they are loitering around, 3 out of 10. This is very, very destabilizing for the economy, right? And when we contrast this with the countries that faces the greatest skill shortages, right? This is a big surprise, okay, right? So India has a very large population, and we have a lot of young people not doing much. At the same time, they are facing skill shortages, right? In the case of Japan, we can understand why they have skill shortages, because they simply don't have enough young people. Right? They have all the retirees who, they couldn't care anymore. Right? They just it's okay. Well, for India, right, we have a serious mismatch, right, serious mismatch, and the policy here is not monetary something the monetary policy can help. So the right solution here would be education policy, right? You have to have the right education policy to build this to solve this problem. So while we study the economy, we spend a lot of time looking at monetary, fiscal, and currency policy. Right? Every now and then, we will realize that education policy is a very, very important part when we try to understand a country's development. Right? So finally, this is the framework, right, for you to think about how to approach this question that we have been talking about. The first question is the economy getting stronger or weaker, right? And this must be in relation to potential GDP, right? So if you're going to be investing in any country, you need to predict government policy. You need to predict monetary, fiscal currency policy. But in order to predict this, you need to know whether the country is growing stronger or weaker. Right? And for this, you need to know potential GDP. Right? So it is extremely critical to know the potential GDP of any country that you invest in. Then what is potential GDP? Well, it's a function of labor force and productivity. Right? And when we try to understand all this, right, we are constantly looking at the national income and how the national income, like the pie, can be divided into wages, rent, profit, and interest, taxes, and depreciation. Right, and as workers, we are interested in the wages share of the GDP. Right? Every now and then, I have students who would write to me and say something like this, right? So what's your thought on Japan's economy with a negative interest rate for so long? Is it sustainable, and can it survive with negative interest rates, right? Plus, now they're adding a second round of stimulus package, right? So my answer to this student is to reiterate, right, this concept of potential GDP equals to labor multiplied by productivity, right? So the question then is, how will these new policies increase labor force and productivity? How would negative interest rate, right, makes the labor force more skillful, right? How does negative interest rate help to increase productivity? Right? Would it really encourage company to borrow money to build new plants, right? And new investment that would not show any result until 5, 8, 10 years from now, right? And if they were to get the aging population to spend money, right, short term it might work. Short term it might work, right? But if the government were to be dropping helicopter money to the population, then the question is who will pay for this later on, right? Would it mean that the government would incur a larger and larger government debt, right? Or would they eventually have to raise taxes on the future generation? Okay? And if it is by forcing wages to go up, right, then it will not help, right? Then it will not help, especially when forcing wages to increase artificially and above productivity. That means that unit labor costs will go up. If unit labor cost goes up, then profit margin will suffer and company will fire workers, right? The conclusion is that on this Japanese situation, that the GDP will remain weak, but stock could go up. Okay, not because of government spending, but because things are so bad that it's easy for the Bank of Japan to consider and continue to buy the ETF in their market in order to create some kind of asset inflation that hopefully would increase the wealth effect and increase spending through the economy. Well, we reached the end of this module, right? And thank you very much. Okay? Right, bye-bye.